For new watchmakers, removing and replacing shock springs might seem like one of those things that's just better left alone. Oftentimes for new watchmakers, the thought of removing and replacing shock springs in order to clean the end stones is one of those jobs that you just keep putting off and putting off because you don't want to risk either losing or breaking the spring. Cleaning and lubricating the end stone for the balance pivots is not only necessary, but it's critical in order for the balance to be able to have an equal amplitude in the dial up and dial down position. Because if the horizontal positions aren't equal, or at least very close to being equal, you're not going to be able to regulate the watch. Today, I'm going to take the mystery out of these little springs by showing you a couple tools you can use to ensure your success at removing springs, one store-bought, and my favorite tool, which is handmade, as well as some best practices to use while working on shock springs so you don't lose them. Now, by the end of this lesson, you'll be able to successfully remove and install the vast majority of the shock springs that you run into just by mastering these 4 springs. And I'm going to show you starting right now. All right, for the first couple jewels that we're going to do, we're just really going to need some basic tools. So you're either going to want a couple pair of tweezers or a tweezer and a needling tool. These are my carbon steel Dumont 3Cs. I keep these dressed to an extremely fine tip. I mean, these are like a needle. I also keep them polished and I clean them regularly to make sure there's no dirt, residue, oil, dust, or anything like that on them. The second pair of tweezers that I use is a pair of Bergeron bronze tweezers. The problem that I originally had with these is that they were too big and clumpy. So what I ended up doing is filing down the tip of the tweezer so that they more match the profile of the Dumont 3Cs. And now these are my go-to tweezers when I'm working on a movement most of the time. I mean, I still love these Dumonts because I've been using them so long, but I find myself going to the bronze tweezers more and more. And then, of course, the needling tool is just a sewing needle that's been sharpened and polished that's sitting inside a 5mm piece of pegwood that I've glued inside. And I use this for all types of things, but they're really well suited for working on shock springs as well. Now, there's a couple best practices that I would recommend that you follow anytime you're working on shock springs or jewels or anything like that. The first is to keep a clean work surface. If a spring or a jewel is to jump off of the movement, the less clutter you have on your workbench, the less things that spring or jewel has to hide behind. And of course, anytime you're working on balance jewels, you want to make sure that your surface has been wiped down. I just use Windex and paper towels to clean my workbench, to clean my work mat, to make sure that they're dust free. You also want to make sure there's no distractions that are going to break your concentration while you're actually working with the jewels and the springs. The last thing you want to have to do is get up from your bench, leaving unfinished work or unsecured springs in the middle of servicing a jewel, because that's really just a recipe for disaster. You also want to be very mindful and stay focused on that jewel while the spring is open so that you always know where it is. As many of you might know, these springs can get lost just like that. So concentration on what you're doing, the task at hand, is very important. One of the things that I do anytime I'm working on a jewel, I like to keep a little metal tray and a clean piece of Rodico so that if I have to pick up a jewel off of the movement, I drop it in the tray and then I move it well out of my reach. The last thing you want to do is put a jewel down in front of you and then have your hand touch it, unknowingly having the springs or the jewel stick to your hand before you realize it, and then reaching over in a different direction and having it drop. That's just another way that springs and jewels get lost. Now let's get to the first jewel. Now the first shock spring that we're going to look at is the Incobloc, which is used in, God, tons of watches. One of the biggest problems that people seem to have with this one is the spring coming out of the jewel block. Now this jewel is relatively easy to do. We'll start by unclipping one side of the jewel by gently pressing on the jewel until it releases from the block. Now we're going to just gently push on the other side until the second side is released. Now it's at this point where things can go a little bit awry. So what you want to do is just pull the shock spring straight back. Don't let it get sideways. And now the jewel is exposed. And now you can remove the chaton and end stone to clean and lubricate it. Now, very simply to reinstall, just make sure to push more from the middle of the shock spring. Now to close the spring, just simply take your tweezer, lightly push down until the first side goes into the jewel block, and then just repeat on the second side. Just giving it a little bit of downward pressure, and it will slide right into the groove in the block. And that's the Incobloc spring. Now for the second spring, we have a KIF style that's in this Seiko. And these type of springs have 3 little fingers that hold it into the jewel block. This one's a little bit easier to work on because there's only one groove that you have to worry about getting the pins in or the finger in. To remove the jewel, I like to take 2 pairs of tweezers. I like to keep one tweezer point inside the spring just to keep it from flying away, while using the other one to turn. Now once 2 of the fingers have been released, the jewel will be free. And to pick up the jewel, I simply use a piece of Rodico, just lightly touch it, and then I put it in my tray, and I move the tray to the other side of my bench so that nothing can touch it or hit the tray to disturb it. Now to replace the spring, we're simply going to pick up our Rodico that has our spring attached to it. And the first thing we want to do is just kind of get it into place where it needs to be. So I'm going to bring it over and just release it from the Rodico. Now I like to work in a clockwise direction, so I want the first pin to be in the groove that's in the block here. You can see that it's in the groove. And I want the second pin to be right there where I'm going to press it down and then slowly twist it clockwise. Now I'm going to use the needle to turn the jewel. The second purpose of the needle, other than rotating the spring, is going to be to keep it from jumping away. So let's go ahead and get the second pin in position. And I'm going to push it down while rotating it. So now we have 2 pins that are in the groove in the block, and I'm just simply going to rotate it around, always keeping the needle or the tweezers inside the spring to keep it from being able to fly away. And now with the third pin in position, I'm simply going to push it down and then rotate clockwise. Now with all 3 fingers in position, now I'm just going to rotate the spring around so that this curved part is lined up with this cutout. And that's the first style of KIF spring that we're going to do. Now, for the next two shock springs that we're going to do, you're definitely going to want to have a tool to aid you while you're reinstalling the springs. Now, this is a vintage set of shock spring twisters that I have. You can still buy these new, but I don't ever really use this. My preferred method is to make the tool out of a piece of pegwood. If you don't have pegwood, you can also use a toothpick. Basically does the same thing. All right, so in order to make the tool, we want to have some idea of how big of a hole we want to bore in the end of our pegwood. So to do that, we're going to take a measurement with our digital caliper. Now, if you don't have a digital caliper now, you can do it by eye, but digital calipers are one of those tools that you're going to definitely need to have in watchmaking, because there's going to be all kinds of things that you're going to need to measure, like watch crystals as an example. So here's a little tip for you. When I was looking to upgrade to digital calipers, I did a ton of research, talked to a lot of other watchmaker friends that I know, because I wanted accuracy, but I didn't necessarily want to spend $500 on a set of calipers. And what I ended up purchasing are the Matoyas. And Matoya is a Japanese brand, and they make really high quality calipers. Now, in order to test that, what I have is a set of pin gauges. Now, if you're not familiar with pin gauges, these are precision ground rods that are accurate within a thousandth of an inch. To check the accuracy of this caliper, I'm going to use a pin gauge that is 0.60 of an inch. These calipers work in either millimeter or inches, so I have it set for inches. I'm going to insert the rod into the caliper, and you can see that it measures 0.06, which is the exact size of this particular pin gauge. Now, as far as accuracy goes, you can't get any more accurate than that. So the first thing we want to measure for is about how big of a hole we want in the end of the pegwood. Because what we're trying to do is we want the tool to press down on the edges of the shock spring. If we leave the end of the pegwood flat, all we're essentially going to do is push down on the end stone, which isn't going to do anything. So we need to hollow out the end of the pegwood a little bit. So you first want to figure out how big that is. So what I'm going to do is get a measurement of approximately how wide this jewel is, so we know what size hole to drill. Now we can see our measurement is 9/10 of a millimeter. So now we can go to our micro drill bits, and we're just looking for a drill bit that's about 9/10 of a millimeter, and this one looks like it'll work fine. So we just install that into a pin vise. We're going to center that as best we can into the center of the pegwood, and we're going to just slowly just go down into the pegwood about 1/2 millimeter or so. It doesn't have to be very much. Now, the difficulty in using a drill bit like this, doing it by hand, is it's almost impossible to get the drill bit to center in the pegwood. That's going to be easily corrected in our next step when we start shaping the end, but there's a couple other methods to drill this hole that I'll show you. So the method I typically use, just because I own this set, this is a set of Horatec cutters. There's all different styles of cutters in here. This is the Horatec MSA 22.577A, and it has a very fine tipped auger with a very fine point. And this allows you to really get in and center the cutter, and then you just slowly twist it to cut the hole. Now, once we have the hole in the end of the pegwood, then we need to see about how wide we want the outside of the pegwood to be. And in this particular case, it looks like it's about 1.2 millimeter. So now we can just take a piece of sandpaper, or in this case, I'm using a number 4 cut file, and we just need to slowly reduce the end of the pegwood until we get it down to the 1.2 millimeters. Now, if your hole's off center a little bit, you'll need to compensate for that. So you may have to bring down one side a little bit more than the other. And you just keep checking it with your loupe. Ultimately, you want the hole to be in the center of this. Just keep reducing it down until the tip measures 1.2 millimeter. That's close enough. This is another KIF style spring. The one difference is that there's 3 notches, one for each finger. So the way this spring has to be installed is you have to get it in position and then push down so that each individual finger is pressed down equally into these notches, and then twist the spring so that the fingers go into the groove in the block here. So taking them out is relatively straightforward. I'm going to use my needle to keep it on the end stone. So as I turn it, there's no chances of it flying away. And then we just simply turn the jewel until it's free. Now, if I was removing this spring in order to take out the chaton to clean the jewel, I would just simply use my little piece of Rodico and pick it up, put it in a tray, put it somewhere safe. So reintroducing the spring back into the block again. Just going to bring it over. I'm just using my needle to free it from the Rodico. Now we just need to line up the fingers to the cutouts. Now that we have our jewel in position, we're just going to take our tool. We're going to insert it on top of the jewel, and I'm going to give it a little twist clockwise just to check to make sure that all the fingers are in the groove in the block. So now we have the fingers from the spring in the groove, and now we just want to turn the spring a little bit more so that the 3 fingers are centered in between the grooves. And to do this, we'll just use our needle and our tweezers, and we just give it a slight turn. And now each finger is centered in between these notches. The next spring we're going to work on is going to be Seiko's Diashock. And for that, we're going to need a little different tool. Now, Seiko's Diashock seems to be one of the types of shock springs that really seems to give people fits. Now, one of the things that'll make it a lot easier to work on is if the balance isn't moving. Because if the chaton and the end stone are jumping around as the balance is spinning, it's going to make it really hard to get this in. So removing it is really straightforward. So we're going to use a needle and a pair of tweezers. The needle is going to act as our safety. So we're going to do most of the turning with our tweezer. So let's go ahead and remove it. Now it's free. We're going to take our spring with a little piece of Rodico, pick it up, we'll put it in our tray, we'll remove the jewel, put it in our tray, and we'll move it out of the way. Now the tool that we're going to make to replace it is actually pretty simple. So I'm using a piece of 4mm pegwood. So the first thing we need to do is we need to reduce the width of the pegwood so it fits in this notch on either side of the block. Now to do that, you could use sandpaper, but I find it much simpler just to use a razor blade. And what we're looking for is we want to reduce it so that it fits in that notch. because what we're going to do is we're going to use this to push down on the spring so that it goes into the groove in the block. Now, right now our piece of pegwood is flat. We need to remove some material just so that when we're pressing down on the spring, the pegwood is not pushing down on the end stone. So you could do that either with a razor blade, or what I'm going to use is a 3-sided file. And I'm just going to center it the best I can. I'm going to remove as much material as I need in order to be able to clear the end stone. So that looks like it clears, but I'm just going to go a little bit deeper. So that will clear the end stone. And now I just need to reduce the width of the stick a little bit. And for that, I'll just use my razor blade and just reduce it down. So that should be fine. So now we replace the chatoned end stone. Now we bring back in our spring and just use our needle to gently release it from the rodico. Now, using our needle, I'll just position the spring so the two ends of the spring are inside the cutouts. And now with our tool, we'll gently place it on top of the spring, push down, and give it a little twist so that the spring enters into the groove that the spring sits in inside the block. Now that we have the spring started inside the groove, now we're just going to take our tweezer and our pin, and we're just going to slowly rotate it around until the spring is fully seated in between the two notches. And that's how you install a Seiko Diashock spring. So I had a question that came in from one of my patrons named Ray, who asked if I had any tips on cleaning porcelain watch dials, primarily from pocket watches. And actually, I do have one. If it's just a little surface dirt, then you can just use some water and a Q-tip and gently roll across the top of the dial. But the problem with porcelain dials is you get this really fine hairline cracks in the porcelain. So what I found to be the best remedy for that is I just take a small mason jar, I drop in the porcelain dial, and then I add 1 tablet of Polydent denture cleaner. And we're going to let this soak for about 8 hours. If you're not familiar with Polydent, this is actually made to soak dentures in, and I find it extremely useful for cleaning porcelain pocket watch dials. It'll actually brighten the whiteness of the dial, but more importantly, it gets into the small cracks and crevices in the hazing that's on the porcelain, whitening inside those areas. So when you're looking at the dial, they're just not as noticeable. And that's really all you can do to correct the hazing or the cracking on the dial. If you have a porcelain dial out of an old pocket watch and it's got a lot of crazing or hairline cracks on it, get you some Polydent, soak it for 8 hours, and you'll be good to go. And because there's so much more to learn, I'll see you in the next video.